Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm LaShawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
Today, we're going to look at what growth looks like, or the signals or the signs of growth, for example, especially personal growth, not just physical growth. I mean, if you have children, or when we're children, we might mark how our bodies grow, or how we get taller as the years go by. That's one of the things that I think about. And those things that we can kind of measure and notice very easily, but as we get older and we become adults, our physical growth kind of changes, maybe even slows down or stops, and we don't have those markers of growth. And then conversely, when we're looking at our own personal growth, how do we measure growth? How do we notice growth? And what do we do when that happens, when we notice growth? So a personal story, we've talked about this on previous episodes. I'm now going through a leadership transition at the nonprofit where I work. And it is, things come up, especially if you're kind of building the plane as you're flying. And it's a work in progress, and there's no blueprint, there's a plan, but certain things come up that you don't control or that you may not know about. And one thing that has come up is certain things that come up, or certain behaviors that I responded to differently in the past. And it kind of gave me pause. One, it was that I had a sense of pride for being in a place where I have room for other emotions besides fear or shutting down. And so those are signals to me of my own personal growth in this journey. And that also brings me to what that looks like in the coaching space when we're working with our clients. When, as a coach, I notice something in the way someone's talking about a familiar topic differently, or they're approaching it differently. And I often will say something to the client in the form of, may I share an observation with you? I noticed that you did this. What are your thoughts? And often they kind of take a pause and like, oh, I didn't notice that, or wow, is that, oh my gosh, and so it's a moment for them of realization that something that's something familiar to them, that they would approach in a different way, can be a signal of growth, or a signal that maybe they don't see it that way anymore, or they have a different perspective. So that's something that I was thinking about, and how interesting that is. How interesting it is when you notice it in yourself, when you notice it in the people that you love, when you notice it in your clients, if you're a coach. Eryn, do you have any thoughts about this topic? What comes up for you?
Yeah, as you were talking, I had to Google really fast the definition of growth, just to take a step backward to help me kind of frame what we mean when we're talking about growth, because we actually use in our, so we're so close to releasing our journal. It is almost ready to go. And it's going to be a really helpful guide for so many people. And in the journal, LaShawn and I have a little note to the reader and the person who will be writing in the journal. And we say we like growth or something. And so that has always stuck out to me as something that, specifically LaShawn and I enjoy, and we know what it means when we're talking to each other. But I think it can be helpful to frame it. So I just, define growth and self-help is what I put in. And this is what the Google AI overview says. Self-growth or personal growth is the intentional, lifelong process of improving oneself through new skills, habits, and attitudes. Let me take a step back. And attitudes to reach one's full potential. It involves enhancing self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and resilience to improve mental, physical, and emotional well being. So, common examples include practicing active listening, overcoming procrastination, or adopting a growth mindset. Synonyms include self development, personal development, self improvement, or self actualization. And I think that self actualization word for me is what I think of when I think of growth. And when I left, my 9 to 5 job, I was so fearful that I would stop growing, mostly professionally, right? Or mostly in my own education, professional education, that way too. And so this definition really aligns with what unraveled and what happened over the past 6 years or however many years that's been, where there has been intentional growth and trainings that I've taken part in for my work to as a grief support specialist, as a author, those sorts of things. There's been a lot of intention behind that, but there's also been a lot of more space to explore things a little bit differently than I would in a 9 to 5. And so I know right now that for me, I can look back and see that the self actualization was because I created maybe a little bit more space. And then on the other end of that, I always run into this I create more space and then I fill it really quickly thing, which kind of sets me back in my own personal growth as well. And so I must say, I was thinking about this today and the space that I'm allowing myself to listen to my body more, because I coached third and fourth grade girls basketball game this morning and was up all night with my daughter who has a broken bone. And it just was kind of felt like a lot after a actually really busy work week. And I know it's a little different than my 9 to 5 used to be, but it was busy. And so I was able to just like be okay with not doing anything after coaching and just be okay with creating more space in my day by breathing more, listening to what is going on with my fatigue and those sorts of things. And I know there's a lot of privilege in that to be able to have that space, right? So there's that piece as well. But on the other end of it, I used to never have that space. I would just go all the way until I'd be on full burnout mode and completely just like shut down. And that impacted my mental health as someone who navigates a mental health challenge that I've had, throughout my adulthood. It really is about, for me, being able to align my needs for that challenge for my mental health along with the workspace and my family time and all of those things. And so I don't love the word balance, but for me, that growth has shown up in more balance and also the ability to be less worried all the time. Because I think I have more, try to create more pockets of space, even if they're 10 minutes. It's like that intention. So those are where I kind of went with the growth aspect, and can look back and appreciate, the gift that I've been given to have a little bit more of a flexible job right now, and use that as a way to really be much more aware of what I can do to effectively show up as the best person I can in this world.
I love that you brought in the definition, giving that context and a common term that we can all look at and understand what we're talking about when we mention the word growth. And while you were reading that definition, I was thinking about the two words of intentionality, like intentional improvement, and how that is definitely something that I have experienced in my own growth. Like I set out to improve my mindset or to improve my self-care and self-awareness and perspective, and also my sense of well-being, my sense of safety, I guess, psychological safety, in my own mind, like in terms of being kinder to myself, allowing myself to make mistakes, allowing myself to be messy, allowing things to be ambiguous, allowing myself to sit in being in discomfort. those things were intentional. And one thing that came to mind is how growth and signals of growth, meaning maybe even in this case, in the context of the definition, if we're using some of the terms in the definition improvement, although I do have to say that that word to me, improvement, is challenging because it
Mm-hmm.
suggests that it suggests a need to fix or a need to, that however you are is not good, or it brings in, I think it's just loaded the idea of improvement, for lack of a better word. um it's, but I can't think, maybe evolution is more neutral. But yeah, I would say like evolution is more neutral because it suggests that there's some movement,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not qualifying that movement. It's just information. I guess I lean more towards the idea of evolution as opposed to, or even growth actually in itself. Like if you think about growth in terms of a seed into a plant, or growth of a human being, or growth of a organic uh, being. um, there's no, I don't feel like there's a lot of heaviness there. But when you talk about uh, improvement, that's where I just kind of, I don't know, that word is kind of, it's prickly to me.
Mm. I know. I love that you pointed that out because with improvement, I felt it in two different ways. The same way that you're talking about with that kind of like, it feels like there's a judgment with it and that doesn't feel good. But then on the other end of it, if it's like things feel really improved, if they feel improved, it's like, oh wow, that feels great, right? To know that I was here and now I'm here. So that still could relate to the term that you said, evolution, right, versus improvement, and that would probably capture both ends of that change and then that reflection about the change. And so yeah, that's, I don't know, I like that you brought that up.
Yeah. So um, one thing though, when I think about that in terms of, I set out to do something intentionally to change the way that I talk to myself, or the way that I view myself, the way that I maybe view change, or the way that I view a less than desired outcome. And so intentionally, I'm changing my mindset. I'm becoming more aware of those things. And so when I set out to do that intentionally, to develop my, emotional intelligence, my just self-compassion, I have this, I guess I have this image in mind of how I'm going to be, or maybe even I have this idea of how I'm going to feel, how I'm going to carry myself. And what this experience with the leadership transition has shown me is that often when we are changing the way that we approach situations, or we're intentionally changing those things, the outcome often, and when I look at my own growth path, is very windy and unexpected. You know, like in one instance, I'm thinking I'm doing this intentionally so that I can be more confident, or I can worry less, or I can have less anxiety. And what ends up happening is I have a signal of growth in that, wow, this thing that happened to me normally led to me blaming myself, getting upset, beating myself up. And instead, like going internally, but instead, because I have been intentionally being kind to myself, allowing myself to make mistakes, this thing that happens, you know, often, or happens enough that it's kind of a familiar situation. When it happened, I reacted very differently. Like normally I would go inward, like, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? How can I change myself? How can I be better? And this time I was like, no, I was different. I was like, I'm so angry. I can't believe that this was said or this was done. And this is a disproportionate reaction to what I said or did. And I was, it wasn't like it was like the inverse of, like I was beating up or blaming the other person. It was just, there was a strength there that led to a different reaction, which then gave me pause. And despite the fact that at the time I was feeling upset and didn't like that it was happening, it was a great feeling in that it was an automatic response, but it was a new automatic response, which signaled to me, hey, I've grown, I've changed. I'm closer to the person that I want to be. I'm closer to the, I'm closer to a reaction that I would then say, hey, that is a healthy reaction. That is a reaction from a person who believes in themselves. That is a reaction from a person who loves themselves. That is a reaction from a person who has confidence in themselves. And because I had that reaction, I felt good about the whole situation. I'm like, wow, that's really great. That tells me a lot. And I don't know, I just thought that to me was surprising. In my growth journey, being intentional about changing certain things and ways that I look at life, the way that I look at myself, the way that I look at others and situations has manifested in my life in ways that I couldn't have imagined, I think, because at the time I was limited by my, I don't say, but to see my lack of confidence or my lack of belief in myself. So I feel like I'm just kind of talking in circles. I'm trying to like articulate this, but I
No,
can't. But I
I mean, I
wonder
just want
what's
to
coming up for you. Yeah.
say yes. Like you have this big moment where you have a shift in how you responded to something, and this is what you're talking about. And I love that you're sharing that because I can feel that positive energy of like noticing a shift within oneself and feeling really proud of that. And like that's okay, like to own that and feel proud of that. And sometimes it's like we want to dampen that piece of ourselves sometimes. The other thing that was really challenging me is this kind of paradox of time versus intention and how that relates to human growth because you mentioned, and this has happened for me too, like there's certain things we get trained on or certain skills we're really working on to embody, and they may not show up right away, but they might show up in a conversation a year later or 2 years later. And so that piece of personal growth is just that trusting the process. I think it's trusting that when things are not going okay, that you have still done the work, that things will be okay. And not only okay, some of those blips in the road will lead us down better ways of being, better paths for ourselves, and so much more. So it's such a paradox, the time and intention of our own personal growth, and that was what was really standing out to me. The other thing that came up, just because this is so fresh in my mind since we're recording on a Saturday, which we usually don't do, is coaching this basketball team. I coached them last year, different group of girls, but some of them are the same. But just how much more confident I felt in how I was coaching them this year versus last year, just felt like night and day. And I think the players can pick up on that, right? And so, when I entered into the last year, the first year of coaching at that level, I've coached at a high school level, but coaching at that level, I was intimidated by it all, but I learned new skills. I had growth that brought me here to this year where my skills were a lot, I'd say, better, more focused, more at ease. And so there was the process of the bumpiness of it all. Because going back to last coaching season, like not having as much confidence and having certain bumps and things along the road, it just felt like, at the time, what am I doing? But on the other end, I was like, okay, I'm making some headway. We're doing fine. That still just feeling kind of at sea. At sea feels pretty aligned with how some of that felt. And then just like coming into this season, being able to reflect, I think our when we can recognize our personal growth or recognize growth, we reflect and look back and really can see what went well, what didn't go well, and how do we use that to move forward. And coaching, third and fourth grade girls in that aspect is very similar to coaching people in grief, even though it's a very, very different approach that I use, right? Very different but that belief in the individual sitting in front of me or holding a basketball in front of me, like that belief in them that they have the capacity, I think is huge. I think the other piece with that personal growth, though, is that confidence to companion a team or companion someone by, realizing that personal growth or companioning someone doesn't mean I always have to have all the answers, right? And I think that that's the other piece that I have learned about noticing my own personal growth, getting out of that kind of academia world where it felt like you always had to have like answers, being in this world where things can be a little more nuanced in some spaces. It just feels more aligned with my personality, but also just, it also feels maybe that I have grown. And maybe it's not just the difference between being at the university and being where I am now. Maybe it is truly personal growth too. So that if I went back, right, to the university, I would bring all this lived experience, all this intentional skill building and courses I've taking, and I would take it back and I'd be a whole different person. And I think that's what we forget. I think what I forget is, going back to, like, if I were to go back to the university, people are like, oh, that's Eryn, but it's not, right? I'm not the Eryn I was 6 years ago, or wherever at on my lived journey, and I don't want to be that person, right? I want to keep changing and growing and living into what that brings into my life. So I don't know. I might have also talked in circles there.
No, that I think I'm really glad that you jumped in, and I really appreciate you coming in and adding that piece, because it really clarified kind of the thought behind articulating what happens when you recognize your own growth, your own, like you were saying, the intentional skills, and then you can kind of project who you are now into a past role, like going back to university, and then realizing that people are going to see you as probably the person that you were when you were in that role 6 years ago, or expect you to be that same Eryn, but you're a different Eryn. You're an Eryn who's had many different experiences, building your own business and also working with clients and, coaching basketball and all of these other experiences that add to your skill set, not just your skill set, but your lived experience, and how that's going to influence how you're going to approach a situation that may be the same as in it's in the university. But then at the same time, one thing that I thought about was they've changed too. It's not the system. It's not the place that it was 6 years ago. Although it's interesting how we are about that. I have actually a good example of this. When I was in Japan, I taught at a women's college for 3 years, and it was my first time teaching at a college in Japan. And so I had nothing to compare it to. And in Japan, when you're in university, you don't have long-standing contracts or whatever. It's always a contract, and with teachers who are not Japanese nationals or whatever, they don't have like long-term commitments with universities. So it's always like 3, 4, 5. As I was leaving, it was like 5 or 6 years. But anyway, 3-year contract, leave. My first teaching job, and you get accustomed to that. Then I went to another teaching job, and it happened to be just the way life kind of happened. I went out, I taught at a language school, which is very different from teaching at a university. I was teaching young kids and not young adults. And I was learning how to, you know, keep a pace with the kids and their attention span. And I grew professionally a lot in that situation, but it wasn't sustainable. So I decided to go back to that teaching job that I had when I first came to Japan. And when I went back into the same environment, I had some of the same supervisors, even the same office. It was very different. It was not the same place as it was when I was there. I saw it differently, so different. When I was first there, I was, getting my bearings, never lived abroad. Um, that's not true. Sorry. I had never taught in a professional setting uh, abroad in Japan. And so when I went back and I did that, I expected it to be like I pushed the pause button when I left. And when I went back into it, I pushed play. But that's not what happened. What happened was that culture changed. And I had these expectations based on, the 4 or 5 years uh, in the past. And I would do things expecting certain results and not getting it. And it took me a little bit of time to get reacclimated to that same environment and also change my expectations about it. So it's really interesting how and you'll hear this also from people who leave their hometown and come back. They're not the same. Their hometown is not the same. But we have this expectation, which is very interesting to me, this expectation that we push the pause button when we leave a place and it stays the same. And then we
Mm-hmm.
push the play button when we come back. Nope, that's actually not what happened. Things change there too. So that saying, you can never go home again, that is so true because it also begs the question of what is home. If you could ever go home again, what is home? It's that familiar place. It's that place where you know what's going to happen, where it's
Yeah.
predictable,
Well,
right?
it's like that Brene Brown quote of like you belong nowhere, you belong everywhere. And I think that really captures what you're talking about there and with that change of the place, when trying to get back to you, but also like home, is that just a feeling that you have from one point in time? Is it a place that, you go back to in nature? I don't know. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't like when we think of that word too, right? It's like that is with the roots and wings concept of like, we go back to our roots and what do we root into? Are we
Mm-hmm.
rooting into ideals, morals, nature, or other people, structures? I think it's a big question that comes up. So I love that you added that in there.
Yeah. And I love that question that you just asked. What do you root into? Because I love the metaphor of the roots and wings. It's really interesting to me because roots and wings, right? So roots and wings. So when you think about wings, right? And you could probably talk more about this, Eryn, since this is the name of your business, your imagery. When you think about like rooting in, it's you're stationary. Like I think of a tree. The tree's not moving around. It's not, it kind of is, but anyway, it's not like mobile, like, most things that are moving from A to B. And then you've got wings, which takes you far, and high. So can you speak more about that? And I want to also, I'm kind of thinking about this because it's kind of spontaneous, I guess. This kind of um, brainstorm, I guess, of what's happening. The idea of roots and wings, and then what we're talking about with change and growth. I think they're connected somehow.
Yes, yeah. And that piece with change and growth, I think it goes back to that first definition of reflection and self actualization. I think that's when you know you are growing. Because, like we talked about, and you brought up, I think in a different podcast episode, like stasis can still be growth. Remember that big concept that's in my book from a friend, and then that we talk about that floating and then intentionally swimming. They're both forms of growth. It's just different. You end up somewhere else. But I think what the main piece is then that actually crystallizes the growth as the reflection in some capacity. And so I think, when we think about roots and wings, that necessitates reflection because we have to ask ourselves those deeper questions about our own rootedness in the world, within ourselves and what outside of ourselves. And then what gives us buoyancy and wings to move in different directions. And I like wings because it's not linear, right? Like I could be moving a little bit left, right, all over the place. With intention, hopefully, but still, I think that concept alone is a really good imagery for change and how people can reflect on change. And I think some really good coaching questions can come out of that. I know have applied quite a few to the grief and loss space, but just specifically, if we think about it in the coaching context, right? Like even the most basic, like if we go straight into with the imagery of it all, like what gives you wings? Okay, well, that's an interesting question because then that leads us into more self reflection and better understanding ourselves and others. Okay, what are you finding life giving? How does that relate to your roots? That could take you in all different directions, right? Like those are questions that just really have a lot of meaning that will go so many different directions. Another question, let's say with the roots and wings imagery, I'm specifically to personal growth, but when did you really fly? Like, when was that moment in your life where you were at the top of your game or the top? And why was that? What were the conditions that led to that? What were you feeling about that? What were you saying to yourself? Really digging deep into those conditions so that we can understand the conditions that led to that to then move forward with creating robust conditions that create further growth and more hope and healing in one's life. So those are just a few examples that come to mind, but there's so many more. Like that's what I love about questioning. That's what I love about coaching and asking questions. And we mentioned this about the church training last week and how we were really working on those questions and the what and how. And I must say that my husband, Matt, he asked me more what and how questions this week than he has ever asked in our entire relationship. So that was kind of funny, as we were like kind of playing off of what we had talked about last Sunday. But just this concept, though, of that pause of those what and how questions can really help the person that you're coaching see themselves maybe a little bit differently or recognize their value in a different way. And then the other piece of that, why I love what and how, they're not leading questions. There's so many leading questions that we put out there into the world, like, I think you should do this. What do you think about that? Or, like those types of things. And when you just drop a simple what question, drop a simple how question in coaching, you might be surprised where they take you with no, right? We don't want to, the other thing about coaching, since this is a podcast about coaching, we don't want to frame those questions. We just want to ask them. Because once we start trying to frame the questions, then we're putting our spin on it. And I think that creates a different power differential. We want our client to have the power and us to be that humble servant walking alongside. So that's what, again, roots and wings means to me in different ways. But yeah.
I love that you clarified that for me. It really, I don't know, it energized something in me when you were asking those questions. That's one of the things that I love about powerful coaching questions is that they take you places and they launch you into that moment where you felt like you were soaring, and you can look at what was happening in that moment, and you can feel that moment. You can feel what it was like to soar. You can feel what it's like to root in or to get grounded. And then it also brought to me like this idea of how dynamic we are, fluid that we are, and how that then makes sense. The Brene Brown quote about you belong everywhere and nowhere, because this is getting into more like esoteric kind of metaphysical things, spiritual. This is getting into the spiritual. I believe strongly that we are physical and non-physical, that we are a combination of the two. We have our consciousness, we have our abstract things that we cannot see, and we also have our concrete things that we can see, we can touch, we can taste, um, we can smell, we can feel, we can interact physically with this, with some things, whereas other things like concepts like grounded, um, well, that can also be experienced as well. But concepts like love, friendship, loyalty, honesty, integrity, those things are abstract. And therefore, I think that it is an indication that we are both physical and non-physical, that we experience the world in imagination, but we're also rooted in, reality, things that are related to the natural world. So I think that, to me, is something that we kind of, I don't know, underestimate or take for granted, is that we are dynamic beings that are both rooted and we're also flying in a way. How does that work?
I know, right?
So
Yeah, that's
it's like,
exactly it. I always play with the paradox, and that is a
yes,
really good
yes,
framing
you
of that.
do.
Like,
The paradox is something. Threes and paradox. That's your
I
signature.
know. I'm like, but I like how you framed that a little bit differently, the physical and non-physical, and they're still there. They're still very present.
Mm,
Uh, that's a really powerful framing for personal growth, but just I think where we're at in our world. And when you brought up the words love, loyalty, honesty, integrity, I was just sitting here thinking, wow, at the root of it all, maybe we need to be spending time with those words more more than ever. I don't know. I am like, just what are we doing in this world? Why are we shooting people?
exactly. When you bring up those words that have, you cannot find them, you cannot touch them, but they're very real, and they're very, we can almost feel them like viscerally. And then it brings up for us certain questions in terms of like, where are we in this world, what do we value, what are we doing, kind of thing. So yeah, no, absolutely, it really does show how things that are not tangible, the intangible, can be really, they can influence us in so many ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why the reason that recognizing my own growth is so profound for me, because it is like those words that you cannot touch or see or taste or feel. However, when we're thinking about, when they come to mind, they really do affect us. And they're, kind of invisible, but when they come up, it's like, oh wow, yeah, that is something that I care about. That is something that is important to me. And then we as coaches, I think this is just kind of in the nature of coaching. It's part of our skill set. It's a kind of a muscle memory for us. We go into the questions, loyalty. Okay, where am I seeing loyalty? How does it show up? How does it feel? What is it about loyalty that's pointing me this way? What's going on there? Let's get curious about that. So I think that's one of the things about growth. It happens invisible. It's invisible, and it's only when things like a growth moment or a moment of clarity will come up, and you're like, oh my gosh, wow, my values have shifted because of the way that I reacted to that. Because I wouldn't have reacted to that in that way a year ago. So something shifted. What was it? Ooh, I wonder what's different. Well, what feels different? So then you start getting curious and asking those questions. So yeah, it does go to the physical and the non-physical. I think, we're growing, but our growth, personal growth, is happening within. And it is not something that we can measure it. We can measure it by looking at, things that we do. If we're intentional about it, we can measure it. However, if you're not tracking it, you can grow in ways that you didn't know, and then have a moment of clarity where, oh my gosh, I noticed that I don't think that way anymore, or that doesn't bother me anymore, or I'm not afraid of that anymore, you know,
Mm.
or I did that so well. And I sounded really competent when I said that, I felt competent when I said that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. I think that
it's
brings me
exciting.
yeah, to a coaching negative wisdom of like this
Absolutely.
idea of embracing change, and to
Hmm.
be able to do that, being able to use reflection as a tool about one's personal growth, and also be open, right, not only to the change within ourselves and outside of ourselves, but also like the past workplaces or individuals we meet or interact with or things like that, just the change all around us as well as ourselves.
Yeah. And my coaching nugget of wisdom is having to do a lot with just the experience of this conversation and how exciting it is to talk about. And one thing that comes to mind is when you recognize growth or desired growth, I should say, something that you wanted to change, that you recognize that change, you recognize something that's shifted in a way that really serves you, that uplifts you, that empowers you. How do you celebrate?
Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Mayshell Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.